At 12:47 a.m., his phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but he did, and on the other end, silence. Then a voice, small, shaking, a little girl. "Do you sell sugar?" 5 words. He didn't blink, because that sentence wasn't a question. It was a code he created himself, and gave to only one person, a woman who worked for him years ago, a woman he cared about like family. But it wasn't her voice on the line. It was her 8-year-old daughter's, and if a 5-year-old girl is using an emergency code at 1 in the morning, it's because someone taught her how to survive something no child should ever know. The call came in at 12:47 a.m. Unknown number, area code he didn't recognize, somewhere in Virginia, maybe. The kind of number that could be a robocall, a wrong dial, a debt collector working the graveyard shift with nothing better to do. He almost let it ring out. His thumb hovered over the red button the way it always did with unknowns, a reflex built from years of careful living, from the understanding that attention is currency and you don't spend it on strangers. Then he answered, not out of curiosity, out of habit, because Cormac Bellwether had learned a long time ago that the calls you ignore are the ones that come back heavier. Silence, not dead air, not the mechanical emptiness of a dropped signal or the hollow click of a telemarketer's system cycling to the next number. This silence had texture. It breathed. It trembled at the edges, the way a room trembles when someone inside it is trying very hard not to make a sound. There was a low hum underneath it, the hum of a house at night, of pipes and appliances, and the particular frequency that belongs to a building where someone is awake who shouldn't be. Then a voice. Small. Barely louder than breathing. The kind of voice that comes from a mouth pressed too close to a phone, from someone who understands that volume is dangerous. "Do you sell sugar?" Cormac's hand stopped moving. His jaw tightened, not visibly, not to anyone watching, but somewhere deep inside the architecture of his face, behind the controlled expression he wore the way other men wore armor. A wall went up and a door opened at the same time. Because that sentence didn't belong to a child. That sentence belonged to a warning. And when a child uses a warning meant for adults, when a voice that small carries a phrase that heavy, it means someone taught her. It means someone sat her down and gave her words to use when everything else had failed. It means a mother somewhere, at some desperate and clear-eyed moment, decided that her child needed an escape route that didn't require running. He'd created the code 7 years ago, not for operations, not for business, not for the complicated machinery of the life he'd built in the spaces between legality and power. For people. Specifically, for the small circle of people who had worked inside his home, the ones who had cooked his meals, cleaned his floors, organized his shelves. You kept the quiet domestic machinery of his private life turning, while the louder machinery ran elsewhere. He paid well. Better than well. He paid the way a man pays when he understands that loyalty is not something you can demand, but something you can deserve. And he treated them with a formality that some mistook for coldness, but was in truth the only kind of respect he knew how to give. The respect of distance, of not pretending that the power imbalance between employer and employee didn't exist, of never making someone feel that their service was anything less than dignified work. And when they left, because they always left eventually, as they should, because no one should build a life inside someone else's house, he gave them something no severance package could carry. A phrase, something simple enough for anyone to remember, even under fear, even in the dark, even while shaking, something innocent enough to say in front of anyone, in front of a husband, a stranger, a child, without raising suspicion, and something specific enough that if those words ever reached his ear, through any phone, at any hour, from any number, he would know exactly what they meant. "Do you sell sugar?" 5 words. Ordinary, forgettable, the kind of question you might hear at a corner store or a neighbor's door. But in Cormac Bellwether's world, those 5 words meant, I am in danger, I cannot speak freely, I have no one else to call. And I need you to understand all of this from a sentence that sounds like nothing. He'd given it to 4 people over the years, Thatcher Gaines, a driver who'd worked for him for a decade before retiring to a house in the Adirondacks. Old Merritt, a cook who had moved to a quiet life in Sarasota. Eamon, a groundskeeper who'd gone back to his family in Guadalajara, and Giovanna Moreau. Of all the people who had passed through his household, and there had been many over the years, a quiet rotation of competent people who came and went with the seasons, Giovanna was the one Cormac remembered most clearly. Not because she was extraordinary in any loud way. She wasn't. She didn't fill rooms with her presence or command attention when she walked in. She was quiet, methodical. She arrived at 6 every morning before the house had fully woken up, and she moved through its rooms the way water moves through a riverbed. Naturally, without disturbance, shaping things gently over time, without anyone noticing the shaping. She had worked for him for 3 years. In 3 years of pressed shirts hanging in the closet before he opened it. 3 years of organized shelves where every book, every file, every small object had a place it returned to, as if by gravity. 3 years of coffee made exactly right. Strong, black, 1 sugar in the ceramic mug with a chip on the handle that he refused to replace. Without him ever having to ask or remind or specify. She had learned it once, in the first week, by watching, and she never forgot. She noticed things. Small things. Things that most people would overlook because they were too small to matter and too constant to see. She noticed when a light bulb was dimming before it burned out. She noticed when the pantry was running low on something he used daily. And she noticed when the silence in the house shifted from peaceful to heavy, when he'd had a bad meeting or a worse phone call, and on those days she left an extra glass of water on his desk and worked in the far rooms, giving him space without being asked for it. She never pried. She never overstepped. She never asked a single question about his business, his visitors, the phone calls he took in rooms with closed doors. But she was present in a way that mattered. Present the way a foundation is present, invisible, load-bearing, essential. He trusted her, and Cormac Bellwether did not trust easily. Trust, for a man in his position, was not a feeling. It was a calculation. It was the result of watching someone over months and years, measuring the distance between what they said and what they did, while noting every small consistency and every potential contradiction, and arriving, slowly, at the conclusion that this person was who they appeared to be. Giovanna had passed that calculation without ever knowing she was being measured. She was, in the simplest and most profound sense, reliable. And then she left. The day she told him, she stood in his kitchen with her hands folded in front of her, the way she always stood when she had something important to say. Centered, still, as if she were delivering news that deserved a formal posture. She said she'd met someone. His name was mentioned but didn't stick. She said she wanted to start over. A new city. A new life. Maybe a family. She was 31. She wanted something that this house, however well run, could not give her. Cormac had nodded once. He didn't ask questions. And he didn't try to talk her out of it. He gave her a generous final check. Generous enough that she protested, which he overrode with a look. He gave her a letter of reference so glowing that she would never need to use it. And he gave her the code. He said it simply, the way he said most important things. Without decoration, without preamble, without the kind of emotional padding that makes important things feel less important. If you ever need me, for anything, for any reason, at any hour, you call this number, and you say 5 words. Do you sell sugar? That's all you need to say. I'll understand everything else. Giovanna had looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes had glistened, not with tears, not quite, but with something close to tears. The wetness that comes when you realize someone has just given you something you didn't know you needed. She held it. The way she held everything, she didn't let it spill. I won't need it. I hope you don't. That was 4 years ago. She'd sent a Christmas card the first year, a polite email the second. Nothing after that. The silence hadn't worried him. Silence from Giovanna meant she was fine. She wasn't the type to maintain contact for its own sake. She was the type to disappear into a new life and build it brick by brick, the way she'd organized his shelves, methodically, completely, without looking back. He'd respected that silence. He'd kept her number in a file. He'd run a quiet trace once, 18 months ago. Not because he was watching her, not because he was possessive, but because he kept tabs on everyone he'd given the code to. A precaution. The way you check the batteries in a smoke detector you hope never goes off. The trace had given him an address in Woodbridge, Virginia. A name she was living with. A man. He'd noted it, filed it, moved on. Until tonight, until a child's voice, not Giovanna's voice, a child's voice, had whispered 5 words into his ear at 12:47 in the morning. And the smoke detector was screaming. Cormac pressed the phone closer to his ear. His breathing slowed, not because he willed it to, but because his body had been trained, over decades, to respond to crisis with deceleration. While other men sped up, he slowed down. While other men raised their voices, he lowered his. It was the thing that made people afraid of him, though most of them couldn't articulate why. It wasn't what he did. It was the calm with which he did it. He could hear, beneath the girl's whisper, the architecture of fear. The house around her was not quiet in the way houses are quiet at night when everyone is sleeping. It was quiet in the way a house is quiet after something has happened. The bruised, ringing silence that follows a slammed door, a broken plate, a voice raised to its highest pitch, and then suddenly cut. It was the silence of aftermath, still vibrating with the thing that had caused it. How much sugar do you need? This was not a question about sugar. This was, how bad is it? Tell me the scale of what's happening. Give me something to measure. A pause. He could hear her swallow. The small, wet click of a child's throat working. A lot. And my mom is crying. Cormac closed his eyes, just for a second. When behind his lids, he saw Giovanna's face. The way she looked the day she left his house, standing in the kitchen with her hands folded, full of quiet hope about starting over, full of the particular optimism that belongs to people who believe that leaving is the same as arriving. And now this, now her daughter, hiding somewhere in that house, whispering into a phone at 1 in the morning, using words she'd been taught to use when everything went wrong. Tell me how much sugar. He needed her to keep talking. He needed to assess, and he needed her to hear his voice, calm, steady, unbroken, because a child who is hiding in the dark needs to hear that somewhere on the other end of a phone line there is someone who is not afraid. A lot. And my mom is crying. The same words, exactly the same, word for word, inflection for inflection. As if she had memorized them the way you memorize a prayer, or a phone number, or the combination to a lock. As if she had been told, say these words, exactly these words. Don't add anything, don't change anything, just say them and wait. That repetition told him more than any detailed account could have. It told him that Giovanna had taught her daughter a script, that she had sat this child down at some point, maybe during a calm afternoon when the house was peaceful and the man they lived with was at work, or maybe in a whispered conversation late at night after something terrible, while the child was still shaking, and told her, if something happens, if it gets bad, if I can't get to a phone, you go to the bathroom, you lock the door, you call this number, you say these words. Exactly these words, and you wait. And the girl had listened, and remembered, and practiced apparently, because the delivery was too smooth, too rehearsed, too perfectly controlled for a child who was hearing these words for the first time in a real emergency. This was a child who had been drilled. She had dialed this number at 12:47 in the morning. Not 911. Not a neighbor. Not a grandparent. His number. The number Giovanna had made her memorize, the one that belonged to a man the girl had probably never met. A man who existed in her mother's past like a character in a story. Someone who, her mother had promised, would answer, would understand, would come. That alone told him everything about what 911 had or hadn't done in the past. It told him that somewhere in the history of this household, someone had called for help before, and help had come too late. Or come and left, or come and not believed what it saw, or come and filled out a report that went into a file that went into a cabinet that gathered dust. It told him that Giovanna, after whatever experiences she'd had with the official channels, had decided that her best option, her emergency break glass option, the one she saved for the worst night, was a phone number, and a code phrase and a man who sold nothing, not 9/11, him. A sound in the background. Distant, but unmistakable. A door slamming. Oh, not closing. Slamming. The kind of slam that doesn't happen by accident, that isn't caused by wind or carelessness. The kind of slam that is a message, delivered in the language of architecture, that says, I own this space. These walls answer to me. Every surface in this house is an extension of my hands. I can make any of them violent whenever I choose. The girl's breathing changed. It got thinner, tighter, faster. The sound of lungs trying to become invisible. The sound of a body that has learned through repetition that being heard is dangerous. That breathing too loudly can attract the footsteps. That the safest thing a body can do is become as small and as silent as possible, to fold itself into a corner and reduce itself to almost nothing. It was the sound of a child who had practiced being invisible. Listen to me. What's your name? A beat, a tiny hitch, as if the question surprised her, as if she'd been prepared to deliver her lines but not to have a conversation. Sable. The name settled in his ear. Sable, an unusual name. The kind of name a mother gives a child when she wants her to carry something beautiful, though something that means more than it says. A name that sounds like velvet and shadow and the soft, dark fur of something small and surviving. Sable, you're doing very well. I need you to listen. If he comes near you, if you hear him getting close to the door, I want you to say one word, just one. Say more. Can you do that? Yes. Her voice was steady, not brave. That was the wrong word for it. Brave implies a choice, a conscious decision to face fear. This wasn't bravery. This was training. This was a child executing a protocol. She had rehearsed, responding to instructions with the automatic compliance of someone who has learned that obedience is the difference between safe and not safe. She didn't sound scared exactly. She sounded focused, the way a soldier sounds during a drill, the way a nurse sounds during an emergency. Controlled, efficient, hollow in the places where a child should be full. That flatness in her voice, the absence of panic where panic should be, was the thing that told Cormac the most. Because a child who panics during a crisis has not lived through many crises. A child who goes flat has. Silence again, but different now, charged. The kind of silence that happens between lightning and thunder, when you can feel the air itself, holding its weight, waiting for the thing that's coming. Footsteps. Heavy. Somewhere outside whatever room she was hiding in. They moved slowly, not searching exactly, but patrolling. Scanning. The steps of someone who didn't need to hurry, because he knew every corner of his territory. The steps of someone who was letting his presence be felt before he arrived. Because the anticipation of him was as much a weapon as his hands. The footsteps stopped. Cormac held his breath. On the other end of the line, he could hear Sable holding hers. A long, terrible beat of nothing. A silence so complete it seemed to have a texture, thick, pressurized, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring because your brain is straining so hard to hear something that it starts manufacturing sound. 3 seconds. 4. 5. Each one a small eternity. Then, barely audible, the whisper. More. Cormac was already reaching for his keys. The footsteps moved on. Cormac could hear them retreating, not leaving, not going to bed, just repositioning. Moving from the hallway to another room. The living room, maybe. He heard the creak of weight settling into furniture. Oh, a television coming on. The sudden blast of noise that follows a remote being aimed at a screen. Then, the volume adjusting down to a low murmur. The man was sitting down. Settling in. Not sleeping, just occupying the house. Filling it with his presence the way a gas fills a container. Sable's breathing slowly returned to something closer to normal. The whisper came back. He's in the living room now. Good. Stay where you are. Don't unlock the door. I know. 2 words. But the way she said them, I know, carried the weight of a childhood spent, learning the rules of a game no child should have to play. She knew because she'd done this before. She knew because this wasn't the first night she'd hidden in a bathroom. She knew because her mother had taught her the protocol, and she'd had enough practice runs, real ones, not rehearsals, to have internalized every step. Lock the door, get low, be quiet, wait. She knew. Cormac was already in his car. He drove alone, no convoy, no security detail, no second car trailing behind with men who knew how to make problems disappear. That wasn't what this was. This wasn't business. This wasn't strategy. Oh, this was something older than power and simpler than influence. Something that lived in the part of him that hadn't been eaten away by the life he'd chosen. The part that still remembered what it sounded like when his mother ran the water after his father went to sleep. The roads were empty at this hour. Northern Virginia in the dead of night was all chain restaurants with their lights off, gas stations that glowed like fluorescent islands in a dark sea, and long stretches of suburb that looked like the same mile repeated over and over, the same strip malls, the same intersections, the same beige developments named after the trees they'd bulldozed to build them. Willowbrook, Oak Ridge, Cedar something. The names blurred past his windows like a half-remembered dream. He had the address from the trace he'd run 18 months ago. 1847 Millbrook Lane, Unit B, Woodbridge, Virginia. He hadn't memorized it on purpose. His mind just worked that way. Numbers, addresses, names, patterns, they stuck to the walls of his memory like pins in a map, and he could pull any one of them down whenever he needed it. 47 minutes. That's what the GPS said. He intended to make it in 35. He kept Sable on the line. The phone sat in the cradle on his dashboard, the connection open, her breathing a quiet, steady presence in the car like a second heartbeat. With his other hand, he used a second phone, a clean prepaid he kept in the glove compartment, replaced monthly, never used for anything except moments exactly like this, and dialed 911. When the dispatcher answered, his voice was flat, precise, stripped of everything except utility. No emotion, no explanation, just data points arranged in the order that would produce the fastest response. I'm reporting a domestic disturbance. The address is 1847 Millbrook Lane, Unit B, Woodbridge, Virginia. There is a woman being assaulted. A minor child is present in the home. The child is hiding and in contact with me by phone. The aggressor is an adult male, likely intoxicated. I can hear the situation is ongoing. Please send officers immediately. The dispatcher asked for his name. Her voice was professional, practiced. The voice of someone who had asked this question hundreds of times and knew that the answer often mattered less than the information that preceded it. That's not relevant right now. What's relevant is the address and the child. She's still on the line with me. Send someone. He hung up before they could press further. The call was now logged. It existed in a system. It had a timestamp, a recording, a case number that would be generated automatically. That mattered. That was the first brick in a wall of documentation that would be built over the coming days. And Cormac knew, from experience, from observation, and from the particular kind of education that comes from watching systems work and fail, that the wall needed to be built one brick at a time, starting now, back on the primary line. Sable's breathing had evened out slightly. The immediate crisis had passed. The footsteps had retreated. The television was playing. The house had settled into the tense, fragile equilibrium that follows an episode. The equilibrium that feels like peace but isn't. The equilibrium that is just the space between one bad thing and the next. Sable, are you hurt? Are you bleeding anywhere? No. Is your mom awake? Can you hear her? I think so. She was crying before. Now she's quiet. Quiet. That word sat in Cormac's chest, like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples in every direction. Quiet could mean many things. In quiet, after violence could mean exhaustion, dissociation, shock, unconsciousness. Quiet could mean a woman sitting on a bathroom floor, staring at a wall, her mind temporarily disconnected from the thing her body had just experienced. Or it could mean worse. Can you hear her? Even a little? A pause. Sable was listening. He could almost see her, crouched on a bathroom floor, probably near the door, her ear tilted toward the gap between the door and the tile, straining to sort the sounds of the house into categories. Safe sounds and dangerous sounds. She's in the kitchen. I can hear the water running. She does that. She runs the water after. She runs the water after. 6 words, and each one landed like a blow. Cormac's hands tightened on the steering wheel, not from anger, not yet, from recognition. And he knew what running water meant. It meant standing at a sink with the faucet on full, pressing a wet cloth to a swelling face. It meant washing blood off your hands or your lip or the kitchen counter before your child could see it in the morning. It meant creating a wall of white noise between yourself and the world. A barrier of water, sound that muffled crying, that covered the specific acoustics of a woman trying to pull herself back together in a kitchen where the broken glass hadn't been swept up yet. He knew because Smother used to run the water too. Different house, different decade, different man doing the hitting. Same water, same sink, same sound, the sound of a woman erasing evidence, not for the police, not for the courts, but for her own child. And the sound of a mother trying to rebuild the illusion that everything was fine before her kid woke up and saw the truth written on her face. That sound was in his blood. It was the first sound he remembered from childhood. Not a lullaby, not a story, but water running at 2 a.m. and his mother's voice, muffled and rough, saying to herself, "You're okay, you're okay, you're okay." Sable, is there another way out of the house? A back door? A side exit? There's a sliding door in the kitchen, but he put a bar on it. One of those metal ones. He said it was for burglars. It wasn't for burglars. They both knew that. Even Sable, at her age, seemed to understand the lie embedded in that bar. The way certain kinds of security are pointed inward, not outward. The way a lock on a door can be protection or imprisonment, depending on which side you're standing on. Windows? My mom's bedroom window doesn't lock right. She told me that once. She said the latch is broken and you can push it open from outside. Told her that once, not casually, not as a complaint about cheap apartment maintenance. Told her the way you tell a child where the fire exits are. Told her because Giovanna was mapping the escape routes of her own home, the way a prisoner maps a yard, and she was sharing that map with the only person she trusted completely. Her 8-year-old daughter. Every new detail was a chapter in a story Cormac was reconstructing in real time. A man who bars the back door and calls it security. A woman who checks which windows don't lock and tells her child. A child who has memorized a phone number and a code phrase and a set of instructions that amount to, when it gets bad enough, run this protocol and someone will come. This was not a household having a bad night. This was not a couple who argued and got carried away and would apologize to each other over coffee in the morning. This was a household that had been having bad nights for a long time, weeks, months, maybe years. And tonight was the night the infrastructure of survival finally had to activate. Sable. Yes? Your mom. She gave you this number. Yes. When? A long pause, not hesitation. Something else, something deeper and sadder. The pause of a child deciding how much truth to release, how much of the private architecture of her family to expose to a stranger's voice on a phone. She was thinking, not about whether to lie. She was past that. She was thinking about which truths were hers to tell and which belonged to her mother. A while ago, after the time he broke the plate on the wall, she said if it ever got really bad and she couldn't get to the phone, I should go to the bathroom, lock the door, and call this number. She made me say the words back to her. She made me practice. We practiced 3 times. She made me practice. Cormac let those 4 words sit in the car with him like a passenger. He didn't speak for a full 10 seconds. The highway unreeled in front of him, empty and indifferent, its lane markers ticking past like a metronome counting down to something. And he thought about Giovanna Moreau sitting in some quiet, stolen moment with her daughter, rehearsing a lifeline, not a speech about safety, not a vague instruction to call for help. A drill, a specific, rehearsed, repeatable drill, the kind that works under stress because it doesn't require thinking, just remembering. The way you run fire drills in schools, the way soldiers rehearse evacuation protocols, the way flight attendants practice emergency procedures not because they expect the plane to crash, but because if it does, the body needs to know what to do when the mind stops working. Giovanna had turned her daughter into a first responder inside her own home. That line, "She made me practice," was the most devastating sentence Cormac had heard in a very long time, not because it was dramatic, because it wasn't, because it was quiet and practical and matter-of-fact. Delivered in the steady voice of a child who understood, without anyone telling her explicitly. That practice was necessary because the emergency wasn't hypothetical. It was inevitable. It was the sound of a mother who had run out of hope that things would get better on their own, who had stopped believing in the possibility of change and had started building emergency infrastructure inside her 8-year-old, who had looked at her life, at the man she lived with, at the pattern she'd become trapped in, at the shrinking space between incidents, and made a cold, clear-eyed decision. I cannot stop what is happening, but I can prepare my daughter to survive it. Your mom taught you well. He said it evenly, controlled, the way he said everything, but his knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and his jaw was set in a way that would have made any of his associates take a step backward. And he thought about Giovanna, the woman who used to arrange his bookshelves by color because she said it helped her think. The woman who left a glass of water on his desk every morning without being asked, who noticed when a light bulb was dimming, who moved through his house with the quiet competence of someone who understood that care is not about grand gestures, but about showing up consistently and doing the small things right. The woman who had stood in his kitchen 4 years ago, full of hope about starting over, hands folded, eyes bright, and now she was running water over her face at 1 a.m. while her daughter hid in a bathroom and whispered codes into a borrowed phone. This was what starting over had become. Cormac checked the GPS. 12 minutes. He pressed the accelerator. 1847 Millbrook Lane was a ground-floor unit in a beige apartment complex that looked like every other beige apartment complex in the suburban sprawl of Northern Virginia. 2 stories. Outdoor staircases with wrought iron railings that had been painted and repainted so many times, the metal underneath had become a geological record of color choices. A parking lot with faded lines, and 1 broken streetlight that cast an orange cone of dying light over a dumpster and 3 parked sedans. The kind of place where people lived not because they'd chosen it, but because it was what they could afford. And affordability has a way of making decisions for you. Cormac parked across the street, under a tree that hadn't been trimmed in years. He sat in the car for 30 seconds, not hesitating, calibrating, reviewing. I'm running the variables the way he ran every operation. Entry points, exits, unknowns, likely responses, contingencies. He was not a man who walked into rooms unprepared. He spoke into the phone one last time. Sable, I'm here, I'm outside. Stay exactly where you are. Don't come out of the bathroom. Don't unlock the door for anyone except your mother or me. Do you understand? Yes. Good girl. I'm going to hang up now. It's going to be quiet for a few minutes. Don't be scared of the quiet. I'm coming. Okay. He ended the call, pocketed the phone, got out of the car. The air was cold. February in Virginia had a particular kind of cold. Damp, patient, the kind that didn't assault you, but infiltrated you, working its way into fabric and skin and settling into your joints like it intended to stay. His breath made small clouds that dissolved as quickly as they formed, and the parking lot was so quiet he could hear the electrical hum of the one working streetlight 50 feet away, doing its indifferent job. He walked across the lot with his hands visible. No coat, no gloves, no weapon, nothing in his hands, nothing concealed. Just a man in dark clothes, crossing a parking lot at 1:30 in the morning, walking with the measured stride of someone who was neither rushing nor dawdling. He was aware, in the professional way he was always aware, of every window, every door, every angle of approach and line of sight. He was aware that he was visible, and that visibility, in this case, was the point. He was not here to be unseen. He was here to stand at a door. The front light was on, a bare bulb in a porch fixture, and the kind that attracts moths in summer and does nothing in winter except make the door visible. But through the thin curtain, a beige curtain because everything in this complex was beige, he could see the blue glow of a television. He could hear its murmur, the low rumble of a late-night broadcast, voices talking about things that didn't matter to anyone inside this apartment. He could smell something, stale cigarettes, the particular brand of stallness that accumulates when someone smokes indoors with the windows sealed. The ghost of fried food, oil and bread, and something else, something sweet and burnt, and underneath it, seeping through the doorframe like a confession, the sharp chemical tang of cheap bourbon, not fresh, hours old, and the smell of a man who had been drinking steadily since dinner and was now operating in the particular twilight between drunk and sober, where inhibitions are low and reactions are unpredictable. Cormac knocked. Not hard, not soft, 3 knocks, measured, evenly spaced. The kind of knock that carries a specific message. I am here. I am deliberate. And I am not going away. Shuffling inside. The television volume dropped, not muted, just lowered, the reflexive response of someone who doesn't want to miss their show, but acknowledges that the door has demanded attention. Footsteps, the same heavy footsteps he'd heard through the phone, the same patrolling cadence, but faster now, purposeful. The sound of someone approaching a door with the expectation that whatever was on the other side was an inconvenience to be dealt with. When the deadbolt turned, the door opened. The man standing in the doorway was tall, but soft, not fat, just loosened by alcohol and inactivity, and the particular kind of physical decline that happens when a man stops caring about his body and starts caring only about what his body can do to other people. He had the build of someone who had once been athletic and was now subsisting on the memory of strength rather than the practice of it. Broad shoulders that sloped, thick forearms that were more mass than muscle, a belly that pressed against his t-shirt, a faded thing with a sports logo, some team that had probably been relevant a decade ago. He had a broad face, thinning hair combed optimistically to one side in a way that fooled no one, and small eyes that were working hard to look sober. The eyes were the giveaway. They had the wet, slightly unfocused quality of a man who was 3/4 into a bottle and running on the remaining quarter of will. They were also, Cormac noted, the eyes of someone who was used to being in control and was currently recalculating, because a stranger at the door at 1:30 a.m. was not part of the script. His name was Grayland Kemp. Cormac would learn the full name later. For now, he was just a shape in a doorway, a man-sized obstacle between himself and what mattered. "Can I help you?" said with a tone of polite confusion that was almost impressive in its construction, almost convincing, the tone of a man who had just been watching television and was puzzled by this late-night interruption. An innocent man, a homeowner, a guy in his own apartment, bothered by a stranger, except for the knuckles on his right hand, which were red and slightly swollen, and the broken glass on the kitchen floor behind him, catching the overhead light in tiny, scattered reflections, each one a small, sharp witness to what had happened before the television came on, and the air that came out of the apartment with him. That particular mix of bourbon and stale cigarettes and something else, something that didn't have a chemical name but that Cormac recognized instantly. The smell of a house where someone has been afraid. "Everything's fine here, buddy. You got the wrong address." Buddy. The word landed with the casual aggression of a man who uses friendliness as a fence. "Stay on your side. I'm on mine. Everything's fine." Cormac didn't speak yet. He looked past Greyland's shoulder, past the cluttered living room and the television's blue glow, in past the hallway that led to the bedrooms, into the kitchen. Oh, Giovanna was standing in the kitchen doorway. He almost didn't recognize her. Not because she looked different physically, she did slightly. Thinner than he remembered. The kind of thinness that doesn't come from diet or exercise, but from the body's slow response to sustained stress. The way a plant thins when it doesn't get enough light. Her hair was pulled back in a way that looked hasty, not intentional. She was wearing a sweatshirt that was too large for her, his probably, and leggings, and her feet were bare on the linoleum. But it wasn't the physical changes that made her unrecognizable. It was the way she was standing. The Giovanna he remembered stood upright, centered, quietly proud. She moved through spaces as if she had a right to be in them. Oh, as if the air she displaced had been expecting her. This Giovanna was pressed against the door frame, shoulders pulled inward, arms crossed low over her stomach. Not a casual fold, but a guard, a protective posture that said, "The most important thing right now is to make myself smaller." Her left eye was swelling, not fully closed yet, but heading there. The skin around it darkening in real time, the orbit puffing with the slow, inevitable inflation of damaged tissue. There was a mark in her forearm, not a cut, a grip mark, the kind of bruise that comes from fingers closing around flesh and squeezing. She was looking at the floor. She hadn't looked at the floor a single day in the 3 years she worked for him. "Is she safe?" That was all Cormac said. 3 words. Spoken quietly, levelly, into no one in particular, and to everyone in the room. Not a demand, not an accusation, a question, the simplest possible question, and therefore the most dangerous one, because it implied that the answer might be no. The question landed in the room like a dropped knife. Greyland's face changed. The polite confusion evaporated like steam off a hot surface, and what replaced it was faster, meaner, more honest. The face of a man who felt his control over a situation slipping and needed to grab it back immediately, the way you grab a steering wheel when the car starts to skid. "Who the hell are you? Get off my property." I asked if she's safe. "She's fine, we're fine. This is a family matter, man, and you need to leave before I—" He shoved Cormac, hard, both hands flat to the chest. In the kind of shove that's meant to move someone physically and narratively. Out of the doorway, out of the situation, out of the story. The shove of a man who has solved most of his problems by being bigger and louder and more willing to escalate than the person in front of him. It didn't work. Cormac absorbed the contact. His feet shifted, a half step back, no more, and his center of gravity dropped, the way it does in a man whose body has been trained to receive force rather than be moved by it. The shove hit him the way a wave hits a seawall, with impact, but without result. And then, in a motion that took less than 2 seconds, he did 2 things. The first was a short, compact punch to the solar plexus. Not a haymaker, not a wide swing, not anything that would look dramatic on camera. A straight, inefficient strike delivered with the first 2 knuckles aimed at the nerve cluster just below the sternum. It was designed to do one thing: stop forward momentum, take the air out, create a gap between intention and capability. Greyland doubled. His hands dropped from Cormac's chest to his own stomach. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. The diaphragm had spasmed, and for 3 seconds breathing was not available. The second was an open palm to the side of Greyland's head. Not a punch, not a slap, but a firm, controlled contact with the flat of the hand against the temporal bone. Hard enough to disorient. Hard enough to make the room tilt for a second, to scramble the inner ear's sense of balance, to buy 5 seconds of confusion. Not hard enough to cause lasting damage, not hard enough to leave a mark. 2 motions. Precise. Unprofessional. Defensive. Proportional. No rage, no speeches, no continued assault, no breaking of furniture or throwing of bodies against walls. Cormac did not hit Grayland again. He didn't need to. The purpose had been served. The shove had been answered. The aggression had been neutralized. And the man was now leaning against his own doorway, gasping, one hand on his stomach and the other on the wall, his eyes wide with the disorienting experience of being on the receiving end of physical force, an experience that, for men like Grayland Kemp, is profoundly unfamiliar because they are accustomed to being the cause and not the consequence. Cormac stepped back. His hands were at his sides, open, visible. He was breathing normally. And somewhere in the distance, thin and growing, in the way a sound grows when it's moving toward you on empty roads, sirens. Grayland heard them too. His face cycled through calculations. Blame, escape, alibi. Running the numbers the way a man runs numbers when the margins suddenly aren't in his favor. He looked at Giovanna, standing frozen in the kitchen doorway. He looked at Cormac, standing motionless on the porch. He looked at the hallway behind him, the hallway that led to the bedrooms, and beyond them, the window that Giovanna had told Sable about, the window with the broken latch. He ran, not through the front door, through the apartment. Cormac heard the heavy footsteps retreating, faster now, panicked, nothing like the patrolling swagger from before. A bedroom door banging open, the screech of a window being forced up, and the scrape of a body pulling itself through a frame that wasn't quite wide enough, the grunt of effort and the soft thud of feet hitting ground on the other side. Then nothing, gone. Cormac didn't follow. He wasn't here to chase. He wasn't here to punish, to avenge, to deliver the kind of justice that belongs in movies and not in living rooms. He was here to stand between a door and the people behind it. He was here because a child had whispered 5 words into a phone, and those words had activated something in him that was older than strategy and deeper than obligation. Giovanna hadn't moved. She was still pressed against the kitchen door frame, still looking at the floor. Her hands were shaking, a fine, continuous tremor, like a plucked string that hadn't stopped vibrating. But the rest of her was very, very still. The kind of stillness that comes not from calm, but from the body's decision to stop processing information until it receives a signal that the danger has passed. The freeze response, the ancient mammalian program that says, don't move, don't attract attention, don't exist. Cormac didn't approach her. He didn't touch her. He didn't cross the threshold into the apartment. He stood in the doorway, the same doorway Grayland had filled moments ago with aggression and alcohol. And he spoke softly. Giovanna, it's me. She looked up, and for a moment, just a moment, the length of a heartbeat, the space between one breath and the next, her face broke, not into tears, not into sobs, not into any of the dramatic expressions of grief that look real in movies. It broke the way a mask breaks, a crack running through the carefully maintained surface, revealing the raw, unprotected thing underneath. Her face broke into recognition. The kind of recognition that happens when someone you thought had forgotten you, someone from a different life, a better life, a life before all of this, is suddenly standing in your doorway at the worst moment of your existence, and you realize that you are seen. I'm sorry. That was the first thing she said. Not, thank you, not, help me, not, he was hurting me. I'm sorry. Because that is what long-term abuse teaches you. It rewrites the grammar of your self-worth until every sentence you speak begins with an apology. It teaches you that your suffering is an inconvenience to others. It teaches you that reaching out for help is a burden you are inflicting. It teaches you to apologize for bleeding. You have nothing to be sorry for. She started to speak again, to explain, to contextualize, to narrate a version of events in which this was all a misunderstanding, in which Grayland was just stressed, in which she had provoked him, in which the swelling eye and the grip mark bruise and the broken glass on the kitchen floor were all somehow her fault. But a small sound stopped her. A door opening, not a slamming door, a careful door. A door that opened the way doors open when the person behind them has been listening, gauging, waiting for the right moment. The bathroom door unlocked slowly from the inside, the lock turning with a small click that was, in its own way, one of the bravest sounds in that apartment. And Sable stepped out. She was small, smaller than Cormac had imagined from her voice. Her voice had sounded older, more composed, the voice of someone carrying more weight than her frame suggested. She had dark hair like Giovanna's, the same almost black that caught light and held it. Wide eyes that were red-rimmed but dry. She had cried earlier, but she wasn't crying now. The tears had done their work and been put away. The way tools are put away when the job is done. She was wearing pajamas with small stars on them. The kind of pajamas that belong to a normal childhood. To bedtimes with stories and nightlights, and the assumption that darkness is safe. She was holding a phone. Giovanna's old phone, Cormac realized. A backup, probably kept in a drawer, or under a mattress, or wherever a mother hides the emergency equipment she prays her child will never need. Sable looked at Cormac. She studied his face with the careful, evaluating gaze of a child who has learned to read adults the way other children read books, searching for the signals, the micro-expressions, the tiny indicators that tell you whether the person in front of you is safe or not safe, kind or not kind, someone who will help, or someone who will make it worse. She looked at her mother, then she walked to Giovanna and wrapped her arms around her waist. Not dramatically, not with a child's theatrical need for comfort, quietly, firmly, the way you hold something that you're afraid will fall if you let go. And Giovanna crumbled, not dramatically, not with sobs or wails, but in the way a wall crumbles when you remove the last support. She sank to her knees and held her daughter. And the only sound was the kind of crying that doesn't make noise. The kind that lives in the shoulders and the chest, and the way the breath comes in small, shaking gulps. The kind that has been silent for so long, it doesn't remember how to be loud. Red and blue lights filled the windows. The sirens stopped, and in the sudden silence, the only thing Cormac could hear was two people breathing. Together, the officers were professional. Two of them, a man and a woman, both young enough to still be careful, both old enough to have seen this before. They separated the scene the way training teaches you. One with Giovanna in the kitchen, one with Cormac in the living room. A third officer, arriving minutes later in a separate cruiser, checked on Sable. The child was walked to a neighbor's apartment, an older woman named Persimmon, apparently, who opened her door at 2 a.m. without asking a single question, which told Cormac that this was not the first time she'd heard noise from Unit B. Cormac gave his statement in the living room. He sat on the couch, Greyland's couch, still warm from Greyland's body. And he was careful, measured. He gave his real name. He described the phone call, the code, the drive, the interaction at the door. He described the shove. He described his response. He did not editorialize. He did not speculate about what had happened before he arrived. He did not offer theories or context or the private history that connected him to this household. He gave facts the way a good witness gives facts, sequentially, without emotion, in language that would hold up on paper. When they asked about the physical contact, he was precise. He initiated. He shoved me with both hands to the chest. I responded with 2 strikes. One closed fist to the body, targeting the solar plexus. One open hand contact to the side of the head. Both defensive. Both proportional. I did not strike him again. He then fled through the back bedroom window. I did not pursue. The officer, a tall man named Prescott according to his nameplate, wrote it down without expression. Cormac could see him processing. A man with an unusual last name, and a calm he'd seen before in certain types of people, at a domestic violence scene in the middle of the night. The officer's training would be telling him to be suspicious. His report would note the details. But the 911 call was logged. Timestamp, recording, address. The timeline would check out, and the evidence in the apartment, the broken glass, and the bruising on Giovanna's face, The bar on the sliding door, the child hiding in a bathroom with a phone, would tell a story louder than any suspicion about Cormac's background. He was not the story. The apartment was the story. In the kitchen, Giovanna was doing what she had been conditioned to do, minimizing. It was nothing, really. He gets upset sometimes. You know how it is. He's been under a lot of stress with work, and the bills have been... And I said something I shouldn't have said, and it wasn't. The female officer, her nameplate read Fenwick, listened. She did not interrupt. She did not argue. She did not say, "Ma'am, I can see your eye is swelling shut." She wrote, because Officer Fenwick had been trained. In her training had taught her that interrupting a domestic violence victim's minimization is counterproductive. You let them speak. You write down what they say, and then you document what you see, which will almost always contradict what they've said. Giovanna's voice was the voice of a woman who had told this story to herself so many times that she almost believed it. A voice that had been trained over months or years to translate violence into misunderstanding, abuse into stress, broken glass into an accident, a closed fist into, "He just pushed me a little." A voice that had learned to shrink what happened until it could fit into a version of reality where everything was basically fine and no one needed to worry, and please don't make this into something it isn't. He didn't mean to. And then Sable spoke. She was standing in the kitchen doorway. The same doorway where Giovanna had stood minutes before, pressed against the frame. But where Giovanna had made herself small, Sable stood in the center of it. Not defiantly. Not heroically, just there, present, taking up the space her body occupied, nothing more, nothing less. He pushed her, 3 words, spoken in a voice that was quiet but clear, not loud, not angry, not shaking with emotion, just clear, the way a bell is clear, the way truth is clear when it has no reason to hide. Not defiant. That would imply anger, and anger was not what was in Sable's voice, not brave. That would imply she was overcoming fear, and what she was doing was simpler and sadder than overcoming fear. She was stating a fact she had witnessed many times. A fact that was so familiar to her that it required no emotional accompaniment, no dramatic build-up, no wind-up before the pitch. It was just true. The way rain is true. The way gravity is true. He pushed her. Giovanna's face went white. The blood drained so fast it was almost visible. A physical withdrawal, the body's response to the sudden exposure of something that was supposed to stay hidden. Sable. He pushed her into the wall. Then he grabbed the plate and threw it. He does it a lot. The kitchen went very quiet. The specific kind of quiet that happens when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. The officer's pen stopped moving. Giovanna's mouth opened, then closed. And in the space between that opening and closing, in the tiny infinite gap between wanting to speak and having nothing left to say, something shifted. Because contradicting your daughter when she's telling the truth is a different kind of violence. And Giovanna, in that moment, standing in her kitchen at 2 a.m., with one eye swelling shut and broken glass on the floor, and a police officer holding a pen, and her 8-year-old daughter standing in the doorway with the steady, devastating clarity of a child who has seen too much. Giovanna was done with violence. All of it. Every kind. She closed her eyes. She nodded. Officer Fenwick checked the system. It took less than 5 minutes. 2 prior calls to this address, both coded as disturbance, domestic. Both times officers had responded. Both times Giovanna had declined to press charges. Both times the responding officers had noted in their reports visible signs of physical altercation, redness on the face, a mark on the arm, a disarray in the home, but no cooperative victim, no statement, no charges filed. The reports existed in the system like fossils, evidence of something that had happened, preserved, but inert. A pattern. Not dramatic, not escalating in a way that made headlines or triggered automatic flags, just the slow, grinding repetition of a household where things broke regularly and were cleaned up before morning, where the police came and left and came and left, and the door closed behind them each time, and the silence returned, and the cycle continued. The officer noted it in her report. She photographed Giovanna's eye, now fully swelling shut, the skin around it tightening and darkening with the slow inevitability of a bruise finding its final color. She photographed the bruising on her forearm, the grip mark, the 5 finger-shaped impressions in a purple that hadn't fully bloomed yet. She photographed the broken glass on the kitchen floor. She photographed the bar on the sliding door. She photographed a dent in the drywall that Giovanna said had always been there, and that the officer documented without comment. Every photograph was a sentence in a legal argument that was beginning to build itself. Every image was a brick in a wall of evidence that would, over the coming days, become something that Greyland Kemp could not explain away, talk away, or charm away. Giovanna sat at her own kitchen table and answered questions about her own life, as if she were reading someone else's file. There was a flatness in her voice now. Not the flatness of minimizing, not the careful construction of a false narrative. A different flatness. The flatness of someone who has just realized that the thing she's been hiding, the thing she's been spending enormous energy to keep private, to manage, to contain, is now visible. Written down. Photographed. Filed. It was no longer private, and somewhere in the strange, terrible space between shame and relief, a space that only people who have been through this understand, a space where exposure feels like failure and freedom at the same time. She let out a breath she had been holding for a very long time. The next 72 hours moved in the particular rhythm of bureaucracy. Slow when you needed it, fast, relentless once it started, and maddeningly indifferent to the human urgency underneath it. Cormac did not stay at the apartment. He left once the officers had everything they needed, once the statements were given, even once the photographs were taken, once the process was in motion, and his presence had shifted from necessary to complicated. He did not hug Giovanna. He did not make promises. He did not say, "Everything will be okay," or "I'll take care of it," or any of the other phrases that well-meaning people say in crises, and that mean less than the silence they replace. He said 3 words to her before he left. "I'll make calls." She understood. She'd worked for him long enough to know that when Cormac Bellwether said he would make calls, it did not mean he would pick up a phone and have a casual conversation. It meant that machinery would engage. Quiet machinery, legal machinery, the kind of machinery that doesn't make noise but produces results. She nodded. He left. The drive home was silent. No radio, no phone calls. In just the road and the pre-dawn dark and the particular exhaustion that comes not from physical effort, but from emotional containment, from holding everything inside a controlled space for hours, and then, when it's over, feeling the walls of that space start to give. By 9 a.m., Cormac had retained a family law attorney named Claudia Reyes Whithorn, not one of his people, not someone from his world, not a fixer or a connected name or anyone who owed him anything. A legitimate domestic violence specialist with 17 years of experience in Virginia courts, a reputation for thoroughness that bordered on obsessive, and a client list that included women from every economic bracket and every kind of situation. He found her through a referral from a nonprofit he'd quietly funded for years, one of the small, invisible charities that don't put donor names on buildings but do put restraining orders on abusers. He paid the retainer himself, a substantial amount. He did not ask for receipts. He did not ask to be kept informed. He told Claudia everything she needed to know. The history, the code, the phone call, the scene at the apartment. And then he told her the most important thing. Keep my name out of the paperwork as much as possible. My involvement complicates things. The case needs to stand on its own evidence. Claudia understood. She'd been doing this long enough to know that a case with a controversial witness can become about the witness instead of about the victim, and that defense attorneys are very good at finding distractions. She filed an emergency protective order by noon, and the petition documented the events of the previous night, the 911 call and its timestamp, the responding officer's report, the photographs of Giovanna's injuries, the child's statement taken in the presence of a trained child advocate, and the 2 prior disturbance reports already in the system for the same address. An emergency protective order in Virginia is a civil order issued by a magistrate or judge when there is immediate danger of family abuse. It can be granted ex parte, meaning without the abuser present, without his knowledge, without his opportunity to argue or explain or minimize. It takes effect immediately upon signature and service. It orders the respondent to have no contact with the protected persons. No phone calls, no texts, no messages through third parties. It orders him to vacate the shared residence immediately and to stay at least 500 feet from the petitioner's home, workplace, and child's school. The magistrate reviewed the petition, read the police report, looked at the photographs, signed it that afternoon. It was not dramatic. There was no courtroom scene, no gavel, no confrontation across a wooden bench. It was paperwork, a signature on a form, a stamp, a case number entered into a database. But paperwork, Cormac knew, was the infrastructure of consequences. Paperwork was the thing that turned a bad night into a legal record. Paperwork was the thing that followed a man across state lines, across new relationships, across new apartments where new women would be told that he'd changed. Paperwork was the thing that made the next time different from the last time. Oh, because the next time, there would be a file. Meanwhile, Giovanna went to the hospital. Not because she wanted to. She wanted to sleep. She wanted to close the curtains and pull the blankets over her head and pretend that the previous night had been a dream, and that when she woke up, everything would be the way it was before. Not good exactly, but familiar. Manageable. The known quantity of suffering she'd learned to navigate. But Claudia told her it was necessary. Not optional. Necessary. Because a medical report is not just about healing. It's about documentation. Every bruise that's photographed under clinical lighting and described by a physician in medical language becomes part of a record. Every injury that's catalogued with anatomical precision becomes harder to deny, harder to explain away, and harder to reframe as she fell, or she's clumsy, or she bruises easily. Giovanna sat in a hospital gown under fluorescent lights while a doctor examined her. The doctor was a woman named Trilby Montclair, and she had a gentleness that was professional rather than personal. The gentleness of someone who has seen this kind of injury hundreds of times and has learned to be kind without being soft, thorough without being invasive. Left orbital contusion, periorbital edema, and ecchymosis. Bruising to the left forearm, 4 distinct pressure points consistent with gripping force applied by a hand. Mild contusion to the right shoulder, posterior aspect, consistent with impact against a flat surface. Consistent with being pushed into a wall, Dr. Montclair wrote it all down. And she took photographs with a clinical camera, a different camera from the officer's camera, producing different photographs that would serve a different purpose in a different part of the legal system. She asked Giovanna, gently, if there had been other incidents. Giovanna said yes. The doctor asked how many. Giovanna said she'd lost count. That answer went into the report too. 4 words. I've lost count. That carried more diagnostic weight than any individual injury description. Because when a patient has lost count of how many times she's been hurt by the person she lives with, the problem is not an incident. The problem is a condition, and conditions require intervention. Cormac did not visit the hospital. He did not visit Giovanna's apartment. He did not send flowers or food, or any of the gestures that would have been natural and kind, and also, in the context of a pending legal case, potentially problematic. He stayed in the background. He understood, with the clarity of a man who has spent his life understanding systems, that his presence, his name, his reputation could complicate things in ways that would ultimately hurt Giovanna rather than help her. A defense attorney could argue coercion. A judge could question motives. The connection between an accused crime figure and a domestic violence victim could become the story, and the actual story. A woman beaten in her own kitchen, a child hiding in a bathroom, a man with a pattern, would get buried under the more interesting narrative. So he made phone calls. He ensured Claudia had everything she needed. He confirmed, through careful and indirect channels, that the protective order had been properly served, that it hadn't been filed and forgotten, hadn't been processed and lost, hadn't fallen into the particular bureaucratic void where urgent paperwork sometimes goes when the system is overloaded and understaffed. And he did one more thing. He asked Claudia to run a full background check on Grayland Kemp. The results came back the next day. 2 prior complaints in Maryland, filed by a different woman. Different address, different name, same pattern. 1 charge of assault in the 4th degree, the lowest level assault charge in Maryland. The one that covers pushing, shoving, non-lethal physical contact that doesn't result in hospitalization. Dismissed when the complainant withdrew her statement. 1 violation of a peace order, Maryland's equivalent of a protective order, resulting in a fine, a $200 fine. No jail time, no probation, no mandatory counseling. $200 and a stern look from a judge. And then, Grayland Kemp had moved to Virginia and started over. The same words Giovanna had used 4 years ago. Cormac read the report in his office. He set it down on his desk. He looked out the window for a long time. The skyline didn't care. The city didn't care. The system that had let Grayland Kemp walk away from a pattern of abuse with a $200 fine didn't care. Grayland Kemp was not a monster. He was something worse. He was a pattern. A pattern that moved from state to state, from woman to woman, leaving the same damage in different zip codes. Protected by the simple, bureaucratic fact that states don't talk to each other as well as they should, that records don't automatically follow people across borders, that the gaps in the system are wide enough for a man with clean clothes and a cooperative demeanor to slip through again and again, until now. Because this time, there was a child's testimony, clear, consistent, devastating in its calm. This time there was a 911 record from a third party, time-stamped and recorded. This time there were prior complaints from another state, documented and discoverable. This time there was a medical report with photographs and clinical language. And this time, Claudia Reyes Withorn was going to make sure that every piece of paper went where it needed to go, and that none of it got lost. Giovanna's quiet breakdown happened that evening. Not at the hospital. Not in front of police. Not in the presence of any professional whose job it was to help her. In her kitchen, alone. After Sable had fallen asleep in her own bed, which was itself a small miracle. Because for the past several months, Sable had been sleeping with one ear pressed to the wall, listening. Giovanna sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd eaten meals across from Grayland, the same table where he'd told her she was overreacting, where he'd said she was too sensitive, too dramatic, too emotional, where he'd sat after every incident with his hands wrapped around a coffee mug and his voice wrapped in a reasonableness so thick and so convincing that she'd genuinely wondered if he was right, if she was the problem. If the swelling on her face, and the bruise on her arm, and the crack in the drywall were all somehow products of her imagination, her sensitivity, her inability to handle the normal stresses of a relationship. He had been so good at that. So practiced. The apologies that came with flowers. The tenderness that lasted exactly long enough for the bruises to fade. The 3-week stretches of normalcy, of kindness, even, that made her think, maybe this time, maybe he really has changed. Maybe the last time was the last time. She hadn't imagined it. The hospital report said she hadn't imagined it. The police photographs said she hadn't imagined it. The 2 prior disturbance calls said she hadn't imagined it. The background check from Maryland, with its dismissed charge and its $200 fine and its different woman in a different city, said she hadn't imagined it. Her daughter's calm, rehearsed voice saying, "Do you sell sugar?" at 12:47 in the morning said she hadn't imagined it. Giovanna put her head on the kitchen table and cried, not the way she'd cried during the attacks, silently, inwardly, with the water running to cover the sound. Not the controlled, muffled crying of a woman who has learned that her pain must be quiet because loud pain triggers more pain. This time she cried the way you cry when you stop pretending. Full. Shaking. Ugly. Loud. Her shoulders heaved. And her breath came in ragged gasps, and her tears made a small wet circle on the table's surface, and she didn't wipe them away. She didn't run the water. She didn't clean it up. She just cried. And it was the first time in years she'd cried without hiding it. And the crying wasn't just grief or fear or relief or anger. It was all of those things at once, tangled together in a knot that couldn't be separated into its component parts. It was the particular crying that comes when you finally stop holding something and realize how heavy it was, only after you've set it down. 2 days passed. Grayland Kemp had not been seen. He hadn't returned to the apartment. The emergency protective order, served to his last known address and delivered to his employer by a process server, made the terms clear. No contact, no return, no proximity. He hadn't called Giovanna. He hadn't sent texts. For 2 days there was silence. The particular kind of silence that is not the absence of threat, but the rearrangement of it. In the way a storm is silent in its eye while the walls of wind continued to turn. Giovanna slept with the lights on. She checked the locks 3 times before bed. She kept her phone charged and visible and within reach at all times, the way a soldier keeps a weapon within reach. Even in camp, even when the fighting is theoretically over, she checked on Sable every hour through the night, not because she thought Grayland was coming, because her body didn't know he wasn't. Then, on the 3rd day, at 6:15 in the evening, a neighbor 2 doors down, an elderly man named Aldous, who had been watching the parking lot from his window the way elderly men in apartment complexes do, called 911 to report a man banging on the door of Unit B at 1847 Millbrook Lane. By the time police arrived, 8 minutes later, came because someone had flagged the address in the system, and the response time for flagged addresses is faster. Grayland was inside. He had not broken down the door. He hadn't kicked it in, or forced a window, or crawled through the broken latch in the bedroom. Giovanna had opened it. She had heard his voice, the soft voice, the reasonable voice, the baby just let me explain voice, and she had opened the door. Because that is what conditioning does. That is the thing that people who have never been in abusive relationships don't understand. The thing that makes them say, why didn't she just leave? Or, why did she let him in? Conditioning doesn't respond to logic. It responds to pattern. And the pattern, the years-long, a deeply grooved pattern in Giovanna's nervous system, said that the consequences of not opening the door were worse than the consequences of opening it. That a closed door meant escalation. That a locked door meant rage. That the safest version of Grayland was the one who felt in control, and a locked door made him feel out of control. So she opened it. He was standing in the living room when the officers arrived. He was not being violent. He wasn't yelling, wasn't throwing things, wasn't doing any of the visible, prosecutable things that would have made this simple. He was talking, explaining, using the voice he used when he wanted to sound reasonable. The measured, almost gentle voice that said, "Baby, let's just talk about this." The voice that framed control as concern and possession as love, and a man showing up in violation of a court order as a romantic gesture. He was saying he'd changed. He was saying it was all a misunderstanding. He was saying that the guy who showed up that night, Cormac, though he didn't know the name, was the real threat. And didn't she see that? Didn't she see that some dangerous stranger had come to their home and attacked him? That the police had it all wrong? That if she would just call the lawyer and drop the order, they could work this out, because they were a family, and families work things out. He was rewriting the story. Right there, in the living room, with his hands open and his voice soft, and his eyes doing that thing they did. That thing that looked to someone who didn't know better. Unlike sincerity, he was rebuilding the narrative where he was the victim and everyone else was the villain, where the system was persecuting him, where the protective order was an injustice, where the only reasonable, loving thing for Giovanna to do was to make it all go away. The officers knocked. Grayland opened the door. His face shifted, accommodating, cooperative, the face of a man who has nothing to hide and can't understand why anyone would think otherwise. "Officers, no problem here. Just talking to my girlfriend. Everything's fine." The officer, it was Prescott again, the same officer from 2 nights ago, which was either coincidence or the result of the address flag, asked to see the protective order. Giovanna retrieved it from the kitchen counter, where she'd kept it visible, perhaps as a talisman, and perhaps as a reminder that this time was supposed to be different. Prescott read it, looked at Grayland. Sir, you're aware that there is an active emergency protective order prohibiting you from being at this address or having any contact with this person. Look, that's all a misunderstanding. She's my... Sir, are you aware of the order? Grayland's face changed again. The accommodating mask slipped. What was underneath, what was always underneath, beneath the soft voice and the open hands and the baby, let me explain, was calculation. The quick animal mathematics of a man who is used to finding the angle, the leverage, the words that will make a situation go his way. Oh, this is ridiculous. She let me in. Ask her. She let me in. The officer didn't ask her because it didn't matter. In a protective order is not a mutual agreement. It is not a contract between two parties that can be modified by verbal consent. It is a court order issued by a magistrate and enforceable by law. The respondent's obligation to comply does not depend on the petitioner's behavior. Even if Giovanna had called him herself, even if she had sent a written invitation engraved on gold paper and hand-delivered by a courier, his presence in that apartment, within 500 feet of Giovanna or Sable, was a criminal violation of a court order. The law does not negotiate, and on this night, the law did not leave. Sir, turn around. You're under arrest for violation of an emergency protective order under Virginia Code, Section 16.1-253.2. The handcuffs went on. Not roughly. Not gently. Procedurally. The metallic click of one cuff closing, and then the other. The practiced motion of hands pulled behind the back and wrists aligned and metal meeting skin. Officer Prescott read the charges. His voice was flat, professional, reciting language he had recited before and would recite again, language that meant nothing to him and everything to the people in the room. Grayland's face went through one final transformation, from disbelief to fury to something that looked for just a second like fear. Real fear. The fear of a man who has spent years operating in a world where he was the biggest thing in the room and is now realizing that the room has gotten much, much bigger. He looked at Giovanna. One last time. The look was meant to do what his looks had always done, to hold her, to bind her, to communicate without words, the message that had been the foundation of their relationship. You belong to me. This is your fault. You will pay for this. This is your fault. You know that, right? You did this. Giovanna was standing by the kitchen counter. Her hands were shaking. The tremor was visible. She wasn't hiding it. She wasn't clenching her fists to stop it, or pressing her palms against her thighs, or doing any of the small, practiced things she'd done for years to hide the evidence of her own fear. But she was looking at him, not at the floor, at him. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. She didn't owe him words. She had given him years of words, explanations, apologies, accommodations. The endless verbal currency of a woman trying to keep peace in a house where peace was controlled by one person and rationed like a scarce resource. Just no more words. Her eyes said it, not dramatically, not with a cinematic stare or a slow-motion blink, or any of the things that happen in stories to signal a transformation. Her eyes just said, I see you, I see what you are, and I am not looking away. The officers walked Grayland out. The door closed. The apartment was quiet. And that quiet, the quiet of an empty room after the person who filled it with fear has been removed, was the loudest thing Giovanna had ever heard. Louder than the slammed doors. Louder than the raised voice. Louder than the sound of a plate hitting drywall. Because this quiet was not the quiet of someone waiting. This quiet was the quiet of something being over. And she stood in her kitchen for a long time. The lights were on. The door was locked. The sliding door had its bar. But for the first time, the bar didn't feel like a cage. It felt like a wall. And she was on the right side of it. The weeks that followed were not cinematic. There was no montage, no swelling music. No scene where Giovanna looked in the mirror and saw a new woman reflected back at her. Recovery doesn't work like that. Recovery works like physical therapy after a badly broken bone. Slow, painful, full of setbacks, full of days where it feels like nothing is changing, and days where a small, ordinary motion that used to hurt suddenly doesn't. And that absence of pain is so surprising that it makes you cry. Claudia filed for a permanent protective order. The hearing was set for 3 weeks out. In the meantime, Grayland Kemp sat in the Prince William County Adult Detention Center, unable to post bail. Not because bail was prohibitively high, but because the Virginia magistrate, reviewing his history of prior complaints in Maryland, the pattern of escalation, the violation of the emergency order within 72 hours of its issuance, and the fact that he had fled through a window on the night of the original incident, deemed him a flight risk and a continuing threat. The prior record from Maryland, the dismissed charge, the peace order violation, the $200 fine, became the foundation of a stronger case. In domestic violence law, pattern matters enormously. One incident can be explained away by a skilled defense attorney. 2 incidents in the same state can be minimized, contextualized, each packaged as a volatile relationship. But when a background check reveals the same behavior in a different state, with a different woman, in a different year, the narrative shifts. It shifts from, "It was a bad night," to, "This is who he is." It shifts from an incident to a pattern of conduct. And patterns of conduct are prosecuted differently than incidents. The Commonwealth's attorney added charges, assault and battery, from the night of the original incident. Combined with the protective order violation, Grayland Kemp was facing a felony. Not because of Cormac Bellwether's influence, not because of phone calls made from offices with leather chairs, not because someone pulled a string or applied pressure or called in a favor, because the system, when it has enough documentation, enough police reports, enough medical records, enough photographs, enough witness statements, enough prior history, does what it is designed to do, slowly, imperfectly, with frustrating delays and maddening bureaucracy. But it does it. The system worked, not because it was perfect, because people, Officer Fenwick with her pen, Officer Prescott with his report, Dr. Montclair with her camera, Claudia with her filings, old Aldous with his 911 call from the window, fed it what it needed. Giovanna accepted shelter support. Not a shelter itself. She stayed in her apartment, which was now legally hers under the protective order, but the services that came with it. A caseworker named Thessaly, who checked in every 3 days. A safety plan that included a code for the neighbor, persimmon, and a packed bag in the closet. Referrals for financial assistance, job training, legal aid. And she started therapy. Not eagerly, reluctantly. The way you start anything that requires looking at something you've spent years building walls around. The therapist, a woman named Dr. Reverie Baptiste, which sounded like a made-up name but wasn't, had an office with soft lighting and too many plants and a quality of silence that was, in itself, therapeutic. The silence in Dr. Baptiste's office was not the silence of a house where someone was angry. It was the silence of a room where nothing needed to be hidden. The first session, Giovanna spent 20 minutes apologizing. For being late, she wasn't. For taking up the therapist's time, that was the therapist's job. For not being worse off than she was. There are women who have it much harder than me. For crying, she didn't, but she apologized preemptively, just in case. Doctor. Baptiste listened to all of it. Then she said, "The apologizing, that's the first thing we'll work on." Sable started counseling too. A child psychologist named Dr. Winslow Calder, who specialized in children exposed to domestic violence and who had an office full of art supplies and sand trays and games that were, in ways the children didn't realize, diagnostic tools disguised as play. In their first session, Sable drew a picture of her apartment. She used markers, careful, precise, the lines straight, the rooms proportioned. She drew the kitchen small. She drew the living room small. She drew her bedroom small. She drew the bathroom very large, much larger than it was in real life. It took up almost half the page. When Dr. Calder asked why the bathroom was so big, Sable looked at the drawing for a long time. And then she said, "Because that's the safe room." 4 words. And in those 4 words was the entire geography of a childhood spent mapping safety. Not in parks or playgrounds or the normal spaces of a child's world, but inside her own home, where the safest place was a tiled room with a lock and a phone hidden in a cabinet. Over the following weeks, the bathroom in her drawings got smaller. The other rooms got bigger. The kitchen grew a table with flowers on it. The living room grew a window with sunlight coming through. Her bedroom grew a bookshelf. She stopped whispering, not all at once. Gradually. The way a person who has been underground for a long time slowly adjusts to sunlight. Not all at once, because too much light too fast is its own kind of pain. But in increments, the eyes widening, the shoulders lowering, and the voice finding its full register. Her teacher noticed it first. A quiet woman named Mrs. Pennywhistle, who had been teaching 3rd grade for 22 years, and who knew, without being told, which of her students carried things to school that didn't fit in backpacks. She noticed that Sable was raising her hand in class, that she was talking to other kids at lunch, that she had laughed, actually laughed, the unguarded, full-body laugh of a child who has momentarily forgotten to be vigilant. She noticed that Sable had stopped sitting with her back to the wall. Small things. Things that no one would notice unless they knew what to look for. Unless they understood that a child who sits with her back to the wall is a child who needs to see the door. And a child who stops needing to see the door is a child who is beginning to believe, slowly, tentatively, the way you believe something you've wanted to be true for a long time. That what comes through the door might not hurt her, enormous things. Cormac Bellwether did not linger. He checked in with Claudia once, confirmed that the case was proceeding as it should, confirmed that the bills, the legal fees, the medical bills, the therapy sessions for both Giovanna and Sable were covered and would continue to be covered for as long as necessary. He asked no questions about the details. He made no requests. He asked for nothing in return, because this was not a transaction. It was a debt, not Giovanna's debt to him, but his debt to the world, a debt that men like him carry without naming it. A debt that is paid in the quiet currency of making sure that the people who pass through your life are safer for having known you. Then he stepped back. The way he had always stepped back, not from indifference but from the understanding that help past a certain point becomes control if you're not careful. That the line between protection and possession is thinner than most people realize. That the best thing a powerful man can do for a vulnerable person is solve the problem and then leave, so that the person's recovery belongs to them and not to him. He was not a savior. He was a phone call answered at 12:47 a.m. He was 2 punches and a 911 report and a lawyer's retainer, and then he was gone. That was enough. Giovanna called him once, 3 weeks after that night. It was a Tuesday, early evening. On the light coming through her kitchen window was gold. It was a short call. Her voice was different, not stronger exactly, not transformed, not the voice of a woman in a movie who has emerged from adversity with perfect clarity and a new hairstyle. It was more present, less layered in apology. The voice of someone who was beginning to relearn how to take up space in a conversation without prefacing every sentence with sorry, or I don't mean to bother you, or I know you're busy. I wanted to say thank you. You don't need to. I know, but I want to. Thank you for not hanging up. There was a long pause, the kind of pause that holds years of unsaid things, of a woman leaving a house with her hands folded and her eyes bright, of a code given and never used, on of 4 years of silence that meant, I'm fine, until suddenly it didn't. I never hang up when I hear sugar. Giovanna laughed. It was a small laugh, fragile, unused, a little rough around the edges, the way a door hinge sounds when you open a door that hasn't been opened in a long time. But it was real. It was hers. And it was, in its small and imperfect way, one of the most beautiful sounds Cormac had heard in a very long time. Giovanna. Yes. The code still works. It always will, for you and for Sable. But I truly hope, you never need it again. Me too. She hung up. He set the phone down. And that was it. No dramatic final scene, no lingering, no last look across a parking lot or a meaningful nod or any of the things that stories do to make endings feel complete. Just a phone call ending. When two people returning to their separate lives. A connection that existed, not as a relationship, but as a safety net, invisible, weight-bearing, and best when it was never needed. That night, in a small apartment in Woodbridge, Virginia, a girl named Sable fell asleep in her own bed. The lights were off. Not because someone had turned them off for her. She had done it herself. She had reached over the way children do when the dark stops being an enemy, and clicked the lamp off, and the room had gone dark, and the dark was fine. No door slams, no heavy footsteps in the hallway. No television turned up too loud to fill a silence that shouldn't need filling. No running water, no code needed. No whispered words into a phone pressed against a face pressed against a bathroom floor. Just silence. The safe kind. And the kind that doesn't tremble at the edges. The kind that doesn't listen for footsteps. The kind that holds no fear. The kind of silence that sounds, if you listen closely, like a child breathing. Just breathing, in and out. Slow and easy. The simple, ordinary rhythm of a body that has decided, for the first time in a long time, that it is safe enough to sleep. And outside the window, the Virginia night was cold and dark and ordinary, and the street light that had been broken was still broken, and the parking lot was empty, and the world was doing what the world does, turning, indifferent, continuing. But inside that apartment, in that room, in that bed, underneath a blanket covered in small stars, a girl named Sable slept, and in her sleep. And she did not dream of bathrooms or codes or whispered words or the sound of a door slamming hard enough to make the walls remember. She dreamed of something else, something ordinary, something safe,